Hi, welcome back to Chapter 4 of your Ethics, Criminal Justice 310 and Ethics course. Again, we're covering Chapter 4. So this chapter is mostly about racism, bias, prejudice, and so forth. So I'm going to jump to slide 3. You're going to have some links to some videos there, and the first one is a Lake Charles Police Department pursuit report that I did a news media interview several years ago. It's just where a gentleman was chased down, and I say a gentleman, he was a criminal, and he could have killed somebody the way he was driving. But he gets taken into custody. The officers are pretty hyped up, understandably. He wrecked and hurt some other people, and they were pretty upset with him. But they placed him in handcuffs, not necessarily, not the kind way, we'll say. That again, this is a person who was actively and violently resisting. So the cuffs are, they're excited. So they place him in handcuffs, but in my opinion, they did not use an unreasonable level of force. The issue, if you look at the end of the video, you'll see a woman who was a victim in the whole situation. A young black female that was inside the vehicle they rolled over. Could have been seriously hurt, but the way she was treated, in my opinion, was unacceptable. I don't think a man should manhandle a woman that way, especially one that was not resisting and basically did nothing wrong. And my understanding is she testified at the trial of the subject, and he was found guilty later on through with the assistance of her cooperation. She was apparently yelling at him to stop the vehicle while he was running from the police. And anyway, the officer pulled her by her hair, grabbed her by her hair and pulled her. If you got to watch the video kind of slow. He put his knee into her head and pushed it into the asphalt a couple times. And then when he escorted her with her hands behind her back, he raised those. If you can put your hands behind your back and try to raise them above your head, it's almost impossible. Luckily, she must have been very flexible. The officer made sure that he wanted to put her in some pain, and there was just absolutely no reason for it, in my opinion. So you can look at it and kind of draw your own conclusion. And you may be asking, why am I showing this in the chapter on racism? Well, because she was a young black female, and they just, for whatever reason, they assumed that they treated her less than human, in my opinion. Would that happen to somebody else of another race? We don't know, but I haven't seen that yet. I haven't seen, we'll say, a young white female get treated in the same fashion with such a level of force. It was just, in my opinion, again, completely unnecessary. The next thing you'll have is Dean Bland. That video is in reference to a black female who's a well-respected college professor who was walking in the roadway exercising, and she was actually blocking the roadway. And that blocking of the roadway is technically illegal. And the issues I have with this video is she was stopped by the police. They treated her with a significant level of respect and courtesy. And she later posted that and reported that she was mistreated because of the color of her skin. Again, she was doing something illegal. The officers had a polite conversation asking her to, not do it the way she was doing it, because she was blocking traffic. Vehicles couldn't get around her because she was in the road. And there were sufficient sidewalks for her to be walking on. And anyway, but the automatic assumption by her was that she was treated badly because the officers were racist. And this is a clear case where the officers were extremely professional, polite, and had sufficient articulable facts to believe that she had committed a crime and could have actually issued her a citation. But anyway, so that's kind of an example. You got, on the other side of it, the automatic assumption that an officer is racist, I think, is another form of racism that is detrimental to our society. But we also need to understand where those suspicions might come from. I've been called a racist numerous times, and I advocate for people of color. I do consulting for people of color, usually persons who are indigent, who can't afford my services. I do it for free. And I do that, because I understand that people of color in this country have not always been treated fairly. And if I can do my part in making that better, then that's what I do. And if I find somebody who's been mistreated by the justice system or the police, then I will step in and, at least give my expert analysis on it, for, pro bono, free of charge. I've even done that for the public defender's office. And the last one we have there, a link to a DOJ report from Ville Platte Police Department and the Evangeline Parish Sheriff's Office. It's about 17 pages of riveting, it's better than any movie that you will watch this week. Open it, read it, read it slowly, and really try to understand what is happening there. It's only 17 pages. Typically, DOJ reports are hundreds of pages. So please read it. And, spoiler alert, they don't use these words in it, but Ville Platte Police and Evangeline Parish Sheriff's Office were systematically kidnapping people, taking them, stealing them, placing them in a jail cell, and they thought it was okay. And they were even, my understanding, I have some, we'll say behind the scenes knowledge, was the FBI found out about this and called the chief and the chief and the sheriff of these two agencies and said, hey, y'all are doing something really illegal. You need to stop. And I guess they didn't believe the FBI, and I guess he said, who does the FBI know? Who are they to tell us what we can and can't do in Ville Platte and Evangeline, which they were systematically kidnapping people. They were taking people into custody for questioning, which is not something that we're allowed to do. Just, as you see it on TV, bring them in for questioning. We can't do that, okay? That's kidnapping. The only way you can bring somebody in and question them is if you have probable cause and to arrest them, and you arrest them, and then you can attempt to question them, but there's no obligation for them to answer. These officers were taking people in and keeping them incarcerated until they did answer their questions without telling them they were under arrest. So they said, I guess they assumed that they had not actually arrested them. And without Miranda rights, and getting a strip search, and not allowed to use the phone. I believe the assumption was they could do this for up to 72 hours without charge. Now, I've seen that on some TV shows, but if you haven't learned this in your life yet, TV is not real. We cannot hold anybody without the proper legal justification, without charge, for any period of time, period. It's like telling a kidnapper, it's okay to kidnap somebody and keep them in your basement and not let them use the phone and tell their parents where they are or their family, as long as you only do it for 71 hours if you let them go. Because if that were the case, we could be out kidnapping people for 71 hours, let them go. No problem. Police can't do that. The general public can't do that. Anyway, this report is beyond disturbing. Anyway, who does the FBI know? They know the number to the Department of Justice, and they came down on them like a ton of bricks. And they have now admitted that what they were doing was wrong and illegal, and they're stopping. But the fallout from this will be felt for decades. It's massive civil liability. And the reason I bring this up in this chapter in reference to racism is I question how are they able to, by the way, they did this for decades to thousands of people. My question is, how are they able to do this for decades to thousands of people and nobody did anything about it? And I'll tell you why. I've said it in prior classes. It's bullies only pick on people that can't fight back. So these people were poor, most of them of color, is my understanding, and they didn't know that what the police were doing was illegal. They wouldn't do it to somebody like me. And they would even do it to witnesses. If they thought you were a witness, they would put out a investigative hold order, and then their job of the patrol is to go out and pick you up, put you in jail until the detectives can come and talk to you, is my understanding on how it worked. And they thought that was in their authority. And let's say they saw me on surveillance footage walking into a convenience store, and the suspect walked out, and they saw me acknowledge the person in some way. So I'm definitely a potential witness in that particular crime. But I'm under no obligation to talk, and they have no legal authority other than to walk up to me voluntarily and say, hi, we think you might have witnessed this person that walked in. Do you remember this point in the video? It looks like you acknowledged this person. Could you tell us who that person is? And I can say, nope, I don't remember them. I could say, nope, I'm not telling you. I could say, I will not talk to you without an attorney present, or I could be, hi, yeah, that's Tom. I can do whatever I want. And there's nothing that the police can do in reference to that. So they thought they had this authority that made people cooperate with them against their will as witnesses, as long as they didn't tell them that they were under arrest. But rest assured, they were arrested under the Fourth Amendment definition of an arrest and interpretation, but there was no probable cause. In addition, in my opinion, they met the statute for kidnapping. If you take somebody away, secret them from their family, don't let them use a phone against their will without lawful authority, that's kidnapping. But nobody was criminally charged, which is that's kind of confusing to me, because picture your 17, 18, 19-year-old child, you can't find them, and you're looking all over for them, and it turns out for the past 2 days you think they're dead. they've been in a jail cell because they might have been a witness to something, or might have even been a suspect in something. So when we get arrested, they're saying you're under arrest, you have the right to remain silent, you get read your Miranda rights. But they were under the assumption if they didn't arrest you, they could interrogate you without Miranda and like make you talk. And then when you talk, they're like, oh, now we can arrest this person. Then you give them the Miranda rights. It's 17 pages of just riveting information. So please read it. It's very interesting. And moving on. There's a lot in this chapter and in these slides. There is a lot of statistics, basically saying that there is the existence of racism on a statistical level, and that can only happen if there are racist officers out there, whether it be implicit or conscious or subconscious bias. It's there, and it's getting better. I think it's getting better as we proceed. As we progress as a society, but it is definitely still there. So I'm not going to go over all the statistics with you. I'll just touch on some of them. Research has shown that demeanor is an aspect of how a person is treated, and we're all like, probably should be rolling your eyes as I am sometimes. Of course, if somebody is on a traffic stop or in an encounter with the police and they're disrespectful, there's a good chance that they're going to get treated more harshly by the officer, and that's understandable. We're human, and when I train police officers, I try to at least get them to not necessarily condone such an attitude and negative behavior and negative treatment, but try to understand where that comes from. Bad parents do sometimes put out bad children. So I've had situations where I stopped a person for speeding, and they get out and say, my dad is going to kill me, my mom's going to kill me, I'm in so much trouble. If you give me this ticket, I'm dead, and it's like they're in huge trouble. And then I say, well, I give you two options. I give you a ticket, which is going to cost you a lot of money, or I let mom and dad handle it and call mom and dad and say, hey, I stopped your kid for this, that, or the other. And I've done that I did that quite a few times, speeding, and sometimes I would even do it for impaired driving arrest. I wasn't required to arrest the person if I found somebody drunk driving, but I was not going to let them continue to drive. But there were times that I would just release them to the parents, after they had been out drinking with their friends or something somewhere, sometimes even underage. And mom and dad were not happy, and I felt like they could handle the situation better than the criminal justice system. But then on the other end of that spectrum, whether white or black, the person gets out and has an attitude like, what'd you stop me for? Or, I hate cops, or my mom's gonna have your badge, or stuff like that. Well, you want to, you're less likely to release that person. So I would just say to any of us that try to understand where the kid's coming from. And I'm referring to juveniles here. Why did this child end up in this situation? I've had situations where, they people get confused when they deal with a law enforcement officer who treats them respectfully. So with that said, just try to keep that in mind, that the attitude of the person is kind of reflective of a different experience in society, parental, or even how they were treated. I grew up poor. I didn't grow up poor and black, if you can't figure that out, but I did grow up poor, and poor people are definitely treated much differently than an affluent person in law enforcement. You're thinking, you may be thinking that's not true. Rest assured it is. When I stopped somebody and they were drunk driving, if they were wealthy or politically connected, there was a good chance it was not in my best interest to arrest that person. I learned very early on that if I did choose to make that arrest because they had committed the crime, I had probable cause, they should be held accountable just like anybody else. It wasn't a good idea, because the retaliation that I would receive for such actions was substantial. I mean, they let you know that, yes, you're technically right, but if you do it, we will look for a way to make your life a living hell. For instance, I stopped a gentleman, I won't use his name, but I stopped a gentleman whose dad was very close friends with the commander of a state police troop D, and that's where I worked at the time. The person was all over the road, in the median, hit the shoulder, went off the shoulder into the grass. Some of the worst impaired driving behavior I'd seen in my career at that point. Pulled the guy over. He's sloppy drunk, barely could do a field sobriety test, I ended up arresting him, but he kept saying, "Hey, call so and so," and I won't say the name because it'll give away the guy who the guy was at the time. He said, "Call so and so," but he was so drunk he couldn't say the name right, and it was my commander at the time, and I couldn't understand what he was saying. So I arrested him. I put him in the back of the car, and finally he says, "I said, wait a minute, are you saying this name?" He says, "Yeah, yeah," and I was like, "Oh crap!" So I called my lieutenant and tell him what happened. I said, "This guy apparently knows the commander." And he says the only person that he wants us to call to come get his vehicle is the commander. And my lieutenant's like, "I'm not calling the commander to come drive a vehicle for a drunk driver." And I said, "Well, I'm obviously not either. I don't even have the number." And my lieutenant asked me to let him go. And I said, "Sure, all you got to do is tell me to." And my lieutenant knew we were on a recorded line at the time. He said, "I'm not telling you that." I said, "Well, then I'm not letting him go. It's on me as well, because I definitely couldn't let him drive." Anyway, the next morning I was getting yelled at for anything that they could find. And then I wrote down in my report that he was belligerent, argumentative, that we were even given tickets at the time and not booking people in the jail. I tried to give him a ticket and just release him. He said, "No, you get the commander. He's getting me out." And he wouldn't give it to anybody to call except for the commander, which we didn't. It was like 2:00 in the morning. So we ended up booking him into the jail. And I said, that was belligerent behavior. And because I wrote the word belligerent, I got yelled at and told, "You don't write that down. You write your report and you shut your mouth, and your subjective interpretations are not welcome," which they actually are. They were, the things that he said and the things that he did, I'm allowed to write in a report, but it was admonished that I did it. And within less than a week, which usually it took a couple months, I got a notification that the charges had been dropped. And that was simply because of political connection. So, I wish I could tell you that everybody's treated the same, but they are not. We live in the real world. So the treatment of bullies pick on people who can't fight back, and the guy that I pulled over and gave the DWI to that was affluent and knew the right people, he was able to fight back, and I learned my lesson. If I had it to do over again, I would have stopped. I would have called a limousine and said, "Hey, come pick this guy up." I would have called a tow truck and said, "Go take it to his house," and I would have paid the record bill, because that would have been a better outcome than the experience that I had after that. So that's the real world that we live in, or at least it was at the time. It's still the real world today. Okay, more statistics on things like bail, arrest. Bail tends to be higher statistically for minorities, Hispanics, and black people than for white people. It's basically impossible not to know the race of the suspect. It's on the reports, it's on everything. I even had a judge ask me one time when I was having him sign a report, "What color is he?" As he was thinking, "What do I write down here?" And this was actually a black judge. And he tended to ask, "What's the color of the person that I'm setting the bond for?" And he had he was asking because he would set traditionally lower bonds for people of color. It's kind of like, the opposite of the white judge giving a high bond for black people. This was a black judge that would actually give a higher bond for white people versus black people. But I got to know that judge over the years, and I would go to him a lot of times with a suspect and for him to sign a warrant, to sign bond. And I made it a habit to always tell him, "Hey, this person's been cooperative, or this person's not been cooperative and not fun to deal with." And I said, "I'm good with an ROR if you're okay with the judge. You don't tell a judge what to do." And he came to respect my at least honesty and fairness. And a lot of the people that I asked for ROR, which is release on recognizance, they just pay a $15 little processing fee and they're out of jail. He would respect that. And he came and started asking me, he said, "Hey, how's this person? What kind of bond you want?" And if they was, a pain in the neck, I would tell him, and he would give me a high bond, and it didn't matter what color they were. But it took a while to establish that reputation and that relationship with that judge, and I had that with all the judges. So, jury selection. So we need to understand Louisiana. A lot of you are from Louisiana. Has a history of racism. If you weren't aware of that, we live in the southern United States, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Arkansas. So Louisiana, up until just a few years ago, had non-unanimous juries. And the reason we had non-unanimous juries was because if you got 10 people to say guilty, then you got a guilty verdict. They didn't need 12 out of 12. So And when slaves were no longer slaves and they were given the right to vote, that kind of changed things for juries. They could serve on juries, and they're not allowed to be systematically, excluded. So therefore, if you had two black people on a jury, which was a likely statistic, you didn't have to worry about it, because if you had a black person on trial, you could convict them in southern states with absolutely no evidence whatsoever. But you couldn't do that if you had a couple of black people on the jury who would say, "Wait a minute, there's nothing here. We're going to say not guilty," so you'd have a hung jury. So to avoid that, Louisiana had non-unanimous juries for a very long time. That's why it was put in place, and that's why eventually it did go away. So I think that's kind of a stain on our society. But even with the elimination of non-unanimous juries, you can't prove, if a prosecutor says, "Well, I want to get rid of this," or a defense attorney says, "I want to get rid of this juror because he's black." They can be thinking that, they just can't say that. But they have peremptory challenges, which means they can just get rid of the person because they say they don't like their shoes, but it's really because they're black. But there's really no way to prove it. So jury selection and race, are factors. Jury selection and sex are factors. And it's illegal based on those things, but it still can happen. And like I said, there's really no way to prove it. Now, once you run out of peremptory challenges, you have to challenge for cause. Like if you're a police officer, there's a good chance that a defense attorney is going to say, "No, I don't want this police officer on the jury because he's always going to side with the police, or side with the government, side with the prosecutor." And that would be a challenge for cause. They don't have, they need an explanation for that. But again, there's really no way to prove it. It's a sad fact unless you can get into the mind of a prosecutor or defense attorney. Otherwise, jury selection can and probably is racially biased. Conviction rates, we've talked about that. Sentencing rates, we talked about that. Incarceration rates are significantly higher for people of color, like you'll see in slide 12. Per 100,000, there's 2,805 black people per 100,000. And for white males, it's 466. So I'm no mathematician, but that's 600%, 6 or 7 times more likely. And Hispanic males, it's 1134, so even double for Hispanics. So the incarceration rates, and you could say, well, why is that? Well, it could be because people of color are more likely to commit a crime. That's a possibility that we can entertain. And we'll say if it's a murder, that's one thing. So it's kind of, murder's an easy, you write a law for murder, it's an ethical law. It should be there. People shouldn't commit murder. But what if we were to take a law and write it for the purpose of making black people more susceptible to this enforcement of the law? For instance, or even not even black people, even poor people. We write laws that get enforced upon poor people who, versus rich people. There's not a single rich person that I'm aware of out there that says, let's find something that I'm doing and make it illegal. No, they find something that somebody else is doing and make it illegal, and they have the political clout to make it happen. So anyway, the incarceration rates there's a substantial difference, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it could be that certain groups are more likely to commit that crime. For instance, possession of crack cocaine. In the 90s, you had the crack cocaine epidemic, where crack cocaine is the drug of choice for poor people because it's cheap it's much cheaper than regular powder cocaine. And it was in the poor minority neighborhoods, and it was kind of an open street crimes market. So it's easy to enforce the law there. But if you look at actually drug use statistics, white people use drugs just as much or more as people of color, but they're incarcerated much less for it. So we'll say the law should equally apply to everybody, and and it's written for everybody. But with that said, you step back and see how it is enforced. That's a whole different story. If you enforce it only in open air drug markets in poor minority neighborhoods, then that law is obviously going to affect incarceration rates, because it's only enforced in a certain way. They're not going to the suburbs and seeing people walking on the street selling outside their homes. Well, they're not selling outside their homes. They're usually, doing it behind closed doors. So open air drug markets have kind of went away because, why would you stand on a street corner and say, "Hi, I'm selling drugs," when you can just text somebody or social media or what? I don't know how you guys buy your drugs now, so let me know. There was an explosion of imprisonment, of incarceration, starting about 50 or so years ago, and that is the result of the drug war. They said let's let's fix this drug problem by putting people in prison for it, and let's build a lot of prisons and just keep putting them in. And they just kept putting them in and putting them in, building the prisons, and we still got this drug problem. So it didn't work. Finally, we're starting to realize that it's not an effective methodology. So they're backtracking, and they stop building prisons and stop working to try to put people in jail forever and changing the way we do it. But the enforcement of that, most people that are in prison, especially in federal and state, were put in prison for drug crimes, and some of them nonviolent. And the likelihood that you're a person of color is much greater, based on the method of enforcement of those laws. Quick touch on death penalty stats. If a black person kills a white person, they're more likely to get the death penalty. Anybody else kills a black person, much less likely. Those are just the statistics, and I can't think of a rational explanation other than a racially implicit bias or racially motivated bias in how the law is enforced, because the death penalty is basically a prosecutorial choice. They have to seek it on purpose, and it's expensive, it's time consuming, it's difficult. You don't always win, and it takes 14 years on average. So, but those are the statistics, which would explain why black people are less likely to support the death penalty than white people. We talked about the drug war, so we've got that. Mandatory minimums for drug laws, we talked about that. Let's go to mandatory minimum sentence for drug laws. So under the federal side, they made possession, let me give you a drug lesson real quick. Powder cocaine is a lot of cocaine. Crack cocaine is a little bit of cocaine, just mixed with a whole bunch of other stuff. So if you have this much crack cocaine, you actually only have a little bit of cocaine, the illegal substance. But the laws were written in some states. Louisiana is a good one. Actually, we don't discriminate between powder and crack cocaine. But the laws, but in the federal side, they basically said you had to possess a whole lot more powder cocaine to get in real trouble than you did crack cocaine. Just, a small amount of crack cocaine. It was called it used to be 100 to 1. Now it's 100 to 1. Now it's 18 to 1. Anyway, the disparity between crack cocaine, which was generally associated with poor people. Powder cocaine was associated with rich people, because to do a line of coke, it cost, a gram of coke cost a lot of money, where you could go out and buy a $5 or $10, $20 rock. And, it was a much different situation. Cocaine only lasts about 90 minutes. And so the effects of it last 90 minutes. So if you're going to use it a lot, you better have a lot of money. So they wrote the law for the poor people who had the cheaper and less amount of cocaine, the crack cocaine. They wrote that to be much more severe. Those are specific laws that targeted the poor and allowed the rich, powder cocaine user who not necessarily off the hook, but gave them a much lesser penalty if they were caught in possession of or selling powder cocaine versus crack cocaine. Louisiana has laws on the books that make possession of cocaine or crack cocaine or otherwise. It doesn't matter if it's either one. The penalty is the same. But Louisiana has laws on the books that say possession of that is actually required more prison time than for rape. So you have a possession of a 28 grams or more, which is about a candy bar. It's 1 ounce, or a rape. So I look at it this way. If you put a person with, say, 2 ounces of cocaine, he's probably a drug dealer, crack or otherwise, or using a lot. But anyway, that's a felony, punishable by a mandatory minimum of, I believe, 5 years in prison. Whereas a rapist only has to do 2 years in prison by law. So we actually are more friendly to our rapists than we are for somebody who possesses, a significant amount. And I say significant, more than an ounce. Police bust kilos and truckloads and stuff like that. But, 1 ounce is treated more severely than a rapist. And I look at it this way. If I have 2 ounces of cocaine and you bust me, and I was selling that to 5 or 10 people, when I went to jail, somebody stepped right in my shoes to fill that void. So when this drug dealer goes to jail, another drug dealer steps in. That's just the way it is. If I go to Walmart to buy something and they don't have it, I'm going to run over to Kmart or Target and just buy it from there because Walmart's closed, or Walmart got shut down, or Walmart got arrested. You see what I'm getting at? If a rapist goes to jail, there's not another rapist sitting there going, he went to jail and he was going to rape 5 or 6 more people. I need to step in and rape those people that he was going to rape. You see, and so the common sense aspect of it, and I guess this is a personal opinion, but I'd rather see every rapist stay in jail versus letting the first crack cocaine possessor, drug dealer, whatever out. Which one's more severe to society? I'd rather protect rape victims than basically increase the profit margin of the drug dealer that's going to step in to the shoes of the drug dealer that you just arrested. The law is the law, but we got to look at what works, and arresting a drug dealer doesn't stop other people from drug dealing. I wish it did. It was a good idea. We tried it. It didn't work. All right, so that wraps up chapter 4, and we'll see you in chapter 5.